Do you know your neighbor's name? Oh, not the one across the street you wave to, but the one whose bedroom wall is 10 inches from yours. Do you have their phone number? What about the person one floor down? In a 2018 Pew Research Center study, only about 31% of Americans said they know most of their neighbors. The rest of us live in a strange modern paradox. We are packed closer together than any humans in history, yet we are profoundly alone. We live in neighborhoods, but not in communities. We have property lines, but no shared life. It was not always this way. For 1,000 years, the concept of a neighbor was not a social nicety. It was the central pillar of survival. In the medieval world, your neighbor was your insurance policy, your search engine, your emergency service, and your therapist, all rolled into one. They were also your biggest rival and your most immediate judge. To be a good neighbor was not about being friendly. It was a complex, demanding, and life-sustaining skill. It was a set of unwritten rules forged in mud, hunger, and necessity. What if we looked back at that time, not for its kings and castles, but for its forgotten social technology? What if the medieval peasant understood something about community that we have completely lost? Number 21, did you really own anything? We think of ownership as simple. This is my car, this is my house, this is my lawnmower. The idea of not owning the basic tools for your own survival seems alien. But for most people in the medieval period, private ownership of major tools was a fantasy. A single peasant family, a villein tied to the land, could not afford the most crucial piece of agricultural technology, a heavy plow with an iron coulter and moldboard. More importantly, they could not afford the team of 8 oxen required to pull it through the dense, wet soil of Northern Europe. So what did they do? They shared. 4 families might pool their 2 oxen each to form a full plow team. This wasn't a friendly get-together. It was a binding seasonal contract. Your family's survival depended on your neighbor's oxen being healthy and on your neighbor showing up on the agreed-upon day. If his ox went lame, your field didn't get plowed. If he fell sick, his field didn't get plowed. This system is detailed in countless manorial records, the administrative documents of feudal estates. Historians like Francis and Joseph Gies, in their book Life in a Medieval Village, describe how this forced cooperation was the very engine of the open field system, where peasants farmed strips of land scattered across several large fields. You had to coordinate planting, plowing, and harvesting with everyone else. This extended beyond the plow. The village mill where you ground your grain was owned by the lord of the manor, and you had to pay to use it. The village wine press, the oven for baking bread, the local forge, these were all communal resources. You didn't own them, you used them alongside everyone else. This created a world without privacy, but with immense social cohesion. Your business was everyone's business because your failure had a direct impact on their ability to eat. Today, we call this the sharing economy, and think of it as a modern invention with apps for tool libraries or car sharing. But it's an ancient idea we've forgotten. We value the independence of owning our own drill, even if we only use it for 10 minutes a year. The medieval peasant valued the security of knowing there was always a drill to be borrowed, because the alternative was starvation. This deep interdependence, born of a lack of private property, shaped the very definition of a neighbor. A neighbor was not someone you liked. A neighbor was someone whose resources you needed and who needed yours. It was a relationship built on mutual, desperate utility. The modern idea of retreating into our private homes, surrounded by our private things, would have seemed like a terrifying form of self-imposed exile to them. It would have been the equivalent of announcing you no longer wanted to survive. What if the explosion of consumer goods and private ownership is directly responsible for the collapse of local community? How much of our modern anxiety comes from the pressure of individual ownership, the need to have our own of everything, rather than relying on a community pool? If a global crisis destroyed our supply chains, forcing us to share tools and resources with our neighbors again, would we discover a lost sense of community, or would we simply descend into violent conflict over a single shovel? Number 20, could you ignore a cry for help? In our world, specialization is key. If a house is on fire, we call the fire department. If someone is sick, we call an ambulance. If there's a crime, we call the police. We have professionals for every crisis. We are trained socially and legally to not get involved. We are told we might make things worse, that we could be sued. The Good Samaritan is a nice story, but in practice, he is a legal liability. The medieval world had no such professionals. There was no 911, there was no fire brigade, no ambulance service, no police force in any modern sense. The only emergency service was your neighbor. If a thatched roof caught fire from a stray spark, the entire village was the fire department. Men and women would form bucket brigades from the nearest well or stream. They did this not out of abstract altruism, but out of stark terror. As a fire in one cottage could easily spread and burn the entire village to the ground. Your neighbor's crisis was your crisis, immediately and existentially. Court-leet records, which documented the proceedings of local manorial courts, are filled with fines for people who did not properly maintain their chimneys or who were careless with fire, underscoring how seriously this shared risk was taken. The same was true for crime. If a thief was caught, the villagers would raise the hue and cry. This was a legal obligation, not an option. Anyone who heard the cry had to stop what they were doing and join the chase. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 codified this practice into English law. To ignore the hue and cry was a punishable offense. The community was responsible for policing itself. They had to pursue the criminal, capture them, and hold them for the Lord's justice. There was no anonymous tip line. You had to physically intervene, putting yourself at risk. This principle of mutual aid was the bedrock of daily life. When a woman went into labor, the gossips, or neighboring women, would gather to assist. They were the midwives, the nurses, the support system. When someone fell ill, neighbors would bring food, help with the farm work, and care for the children. This is beautifully documented in the letters of the Passed-on family, a 15th century gentry family from Norfolk. Their correspondence shows a constant reliance on neighbors for news, support, and aid during times of sickness and political turmoil. There was no other option. To be isolated was to be vulnerable. To be a bad neighbor by refusing to help was to risk being ostracized, which meant you would receive no help when your own inevitable crisis arrived. It was a death sentence. We have outsourced our compassion and our responsibility to paid, uniformed strangers. We pay taxes for these services, and in doing so, we have purchased the right to not get involved. We have traded the messy, demanding, and deeply human work of mutual aid for the clean, efficient, and anonymous system of the modern state. If our emergency services all failed for a week, how many of us would know how to organize a bucket brigade or chase a thief? Have we become so specialized that we've lost the basic human instinct to help the person next to us? What is the psychological cost of knowing that if you cry out in the night, your neighbors are more likely to close their windows than to come running? Number 19. Who decided what was fair? Today, if you have a dispute with your neighbor over a fence line, a noisy dog, or a fallen tree, the process is formal and distant. You might consult a lawyer, you might go to small claims court, you will deal with judges, laws, and procedures that are impersonal and standardized. Justice is something handed down from above by a system you don't really participate in. In a medieval village, justice was local, personal, and participatory. The primary institution for resolving disputes was the manorial court, or court-leet. This was typically held a few times a year, presided over by the Lord Steward. But the key players were the villagers themselves. A jury of tenants, your own neighbors, would be appointed. They were the ones who would present offenses. They would report that John's pigs had gotten into William's vegetable patch again, or that Agnes had diverted water from the communal stream, or that Thomas had failed to do his required labor on the Lord's land. The historian Zvi Razi, in his study of the village of Halissowen, in England, life, marriage, and death in a medieval parish, used court rolls to reconstruct the social life of the village. He found that these courts were not just about enforcing the Lord's will, they were a forum for the community to regulate itself. Neighbors brought grievances against neighbors, and the jury, composed of their peers, would decide the outcome. The penalties were usually fines payable to the Lord, but the real punishment was public shame. Everyone knew your business. Your failure to be a good neighbor was now part of the public record. The system forced a kind of radical transparency. You could not hide from your obligations. If you borrowed a tool and didn't return it, it would be brought up at the next court session. If your livestock damaged a neighbor's crops, you would be held accountable not by an abstract law, but by the very people you had to live and work with every day. This created a powerful incentive to resolve disputes informally before they reached the court. People had to learn to negotiate, compromise, and forgive, because they were stuck with each other. There was no moving to a new town to escape a bad reputation. Your reputation was your most valuable asset. This process of communal justice meant that everyone had a stake in maintaining social order. The concept of fairness was not a legal abstraction, it was a living, breathing thing negotiated and enforced by the community itself. E.P. Thompson, the 20th century historian, called this the moral economy, a shared understanding within a community about what was legitimate and what was not, which often took precedence over formal law. A baker who sold a loaf of bread that was underweight violated this moral economy, and his neighbors would be the ones to punish him. We have gained impartiality and due process in our legal system, but what have we lost? Have we lost the ability to resolve our own conflicts? Does our reliance on a distant, formal legal system make us less willing to talk to our neighbors and work things out face to face? What would our neighborhoods look like if we had to sit on a jury once a year and pass judgment on the squabbles and failings of the people living next door? Number 18, what did your word mean? In our world, a promise is a weak thing. A casual agreement is just air. To make something real, we need it in writing. We need contracts, terms of service, signatures, and notarized documents. We operate on a principle of trust, but verify, which in practice usually means don't trust, get it on paper. Our word is not our bond. Our word is a placeholder for a legally enforceable document. In the predominantly illiterate society of the medieval period, a person's word was their credit score, their legal identity, and their social currency all in one. An oath was not a formality, it was a sacred act, sworn on a holy relic or the Bible, in the presence of God and the community. To break an oath was not just a breach of contract, it was a mortal sin that endangered your immortal soul. It was also social suicide. When a new tenant swore an oath of fealty to his lord, he did so publicly, placing his hands between the lords and promising service. The entire village witnessed it. When people made a private agreement, they often did so with witnesses. Your neighbors were the living record of your commitments. If you promised to repay a debt of grain after the harvest, your neighbors who witnessed the promise were the enforcement mechanism. If you failed to pay, their testimony against you in the manorial court would ruin you. This is why gossip and reputation were so incredibly powerful. What people said about you was, in a very real sense, who you were. There was no credit report to check. There was only the collective memory of the community. Were you honest? Did you honor your debts? Did you keep your promises? A reputation for being an oath breaker or a liar would make it impossible to function. No one would trade with you, lend to you, or help you. The historian Robert C. Palmer, in his work on English law, emphasizes the importance of wager of law, a legal procedure where a defendant could clear themselves of an accusation by swearing an oath of innocence and bringing a certain number of oath helpers to swear that they believed his oath was true. These were not witnesses to the crime. They were character witnesses, neighbors who were willing to stake their own soul's salvation on your good name. If you couldn't find enough neighbors willing to do this for you, you were considered guilty. Your social standing was a literal form of legal evidence. This created a society where your public self and your private self could not be easily separated. You had to live your life in a way that convinced your neighbors of your trustworthiness day in and day out. There was no anonymity. The village was a small, enclosed world, and your every action was noted, judged, and remembered. Have we created a world so complex and anonymous that a person's word is now functionally worthless? By replacing reputation with written contracts and credit scores, have we made it easier to be dishonest? What would change about our behavior if our ability to get a loan or a job depended not on a computer algorithm, but on our neighbors, being willing to publicly swear that we were a good and honest person? Number 17, did you ever eat alone? Think about how we eat today. Many of us eat alone, in our cars, at our desks, or in front of a screen. Even family dinners are often fragmented affairs scheduled around different activities. The meal is often a private, functional act of refueling. In the medieval village, eating was almost always a communal activity. The main meal of the day was often eaten outdoors, in the fields during the intense labor of planting or harvesting. The whole village would be working together, and they would stop together to eat the bread, cheese, and ale they had brought. This was not a party, it was a practical necessity, but it reinforced the sense of shared effort and shared fate. Beyond the daily meals, the calendar was structured around feasts. These were not just meals, they were powerful social rituals that bound the community together. There were the great religious feasts of the Christian calendar, Christmas, Easter, and Whitsun. But there were also local saints' days and agricultural festivals like Harvest Home. On these days, work was forbidden. The whole village would gather. The lord of the manor might provide a certain amount of food and drink, but families would also contribute. People ate, drank, danced, and played games. Historian Bridget Ann Hennish, in her book Fast and Feast Food in Medieval Society, describes how these feasts were essential for releasing social tension and reaffirming community bonds. They were a time when the rigid social hierarchy could be temporarily relaxed. They were also a form of social welfare. The poorer members of the community, who might often be hungry, could eat their fill at these celebrations. Charity was distributed, and the sense of a collective identity was strengthened. Even the architecture of a medieval hall was designed for communal eating. The great hall in a castle or manor house was dominated by long trestle tables where the entire household, from the lord's family to the lowest servant, would eat together. Seating was arranged according to rank, but everyone was present in the same space, sharing the same food from the same kitchen. This constant ritualized sharing of food created a different kind of social bond. To share a meal with someone was to accept them into your community. To be denied a place at the table was to be cast out. Food was not just sustenance, it was a social tool. The modern concept of a dinner party is a pale imitation of this. Our parties are for our friends, people we choose. The medieval feast was for your entire community, people you were bound to, whether you liked them or not. It was an obligation, not a choice. Like in a world of fast food, microwave dinners, and solitary meals, have we forgotten the social power of breaking bread together? Is the decline of the family dinner and the community potluck a symptom or a cause of our increasing social isolation? If we were required to share a feast with all of our neighbors once a month, would it force us to resolve conflicts and build a stronger, more resilient community? Number 16, who took care of the children? Our model of child rearing is intensely private and nuclear. Children are the primary responsibility of their parents and perhaps a paid daycare or a school. We worry about stranger danger. We schedule playdates for our kids to have supervised interaction with other children. The idea of letting your 7-year-old wander the neighborhood freely, under the general supervision of any adult who happens to be around, seems like reckless endangerment. In a medieval village, the concept of child rearing was much more communal. The village itself was a kind of supervised playpen. Children from a very young age were part of the village's economic life. They would be out in the fields scaring birds away from the crops, gathering firewood in the woods, or watching the pigs on the common land. They were not constantly under the direct supervision of their own parents. They were under the watchful eye of the entire community. Any adult could and would discipline a child who was misbehaving or in danger. A child belonged to their parents, but they were also a part of the village. The historian Barbara A. Hannawalt, in her work The Ties That Bound Peasant Families in Medieval England, explains that this was not a formal system, but a practical one. Parents were busy with back-breaking labor. They could not provide constant, direct supervision. The community had to fill the gap. A neighbor would pull your child away from a dangerous well or scold them for stealing apples just as they would their own. It was not considered overstepping, it was considered a basic neighborly duty. This also meant that children learned social rules from a wide range of adults. They learned by observing and participating in the life of the village. They saw how adults resolved conflicts, how they cooperated on the plow team, and how they celebrated feasts. Their education was not confined to a classroom, it was a constant apprenticeship in how to be a member of their community. Furthermore, in times of crisis, the community took over. If a parent died, relatives or neighbors would often take in the children. The concept of fostering was common. Sometimes, even in non-crisis situations, a child might be sent to live in a neighbor's house for a time to learn a specific skill, a practice that was a precursor to formal apprenticeship. The well-being of a child was not solely the concern of its parents. It was a matter of community concern because that child would one day be a working, contributing member of that same community. We have gained a greater focus on the emotional needs of the individual child. But we have lost the village. We have placed an immense and perhaps unsustainable burden on parents to be everything for their children: protector, teacher, friend, and sole supervisor. Has our fear of strangers and our obsession with parental liability created a generation of children who are less resilient and less connected to their communities? What would be the benefit and what would be the danger of returning to a model where any neighbor felt they had the right and the responsibility to help raise and discipline any child on the street? Is the modern playdate a poor substitute for the organic, unsupervised, and community-monitored play of the past? Number 15, how did you know what was happening? When we want news today, we have an infinite number of sources. We have 24-hour television news, websites, social media feeds, and podcasts. We can learn about a political event on the other side of the world in real time. But we may have no idea that our next door neighbor just lost their job. Our information is global and impersonal. The medieval villager's world of news was the exact opposite. It was intensely local and entirely personal. There were no newspapers, no internet. News traveled by foot and by mouth. The primary source of information was your neighbor. The parish church was the main hub. After Sunday Mass, people would linger in the churchyard to exchange news and gossip. This was where you learned who was sick, whose daughter was getting married, who had a dispute with whom, and what the lord of the manor was planning. Travelers were another key source. A peddler, a pilgrimer, or a friar passing through the village was a major event. They would bring news from the outside world of wars, of the king's health, of prices in the nearest market town. People would gather to listen, but this news was then filtered and spread through the local network of neighbors. Information was not a commodity you consumed privately, it was a social currency you exchanged. Gossip was not just idle chatter, it was a vital social mechanism. It was how the community enforced its norms. If someone was behaving badly, cheating on their spouse, being lazy, or not contributing their fair share, gossip was the first line of punishment. It damaged their reputation, the most valuable thing they owned. The historian Miri Rubin has written about how communities used gossip and rumor to regulate behavior, particularly in cases that were difficult to prove in a formal court. This constant flow of personal information created a high information, low privacy environment. Everyone knew everyone else's business. This could be oppressive, but it also created a strong sense of shared reality and mutual knowledge. You knew the context of your neighbor's life, you knew their struggles, their family history, their strengths, and their weaknesses. This deep contextual knowledge is something we have lost. We may follow hundreds of people online, but we know very little about the inner lives of the people who share our postman. Our modern media landscape gives us a God's eye view of the world, but it leaves us blind to what is happening on our own street. We are saturated with information, but starved of local, meaningful knowledge. Social media disappeared tomorrow. How would we find out what was happening in our own neighborhood? Have we outsourced the simple human act of talking to our neighbors to impersonal digital platforms? Is the constant, low-level anxiety we feel a result of knowing too much about global problems we can't solve, and not enough about the local problems we actually could help with? Or number 14, where did the village end and you begin? The modern ideal is the self-made individual. We value independence, self-sufficiency, and personal identity. Our identity is something we forge ourselves through our careers, our hobbies, our personal brand. The idea that our identity could be subsumed into a collective is often seen as a loss of freedom. For a medieval peasant, the concept of a purely individual identity, separate from the community, would have been incomprehensible. Your identity was your family name and your village. You were John, son of William, from the village of Elton. Your sense of self was deeply intertwined with your role and your obligations within the community. This was most visible in the physical layout of the village and its fields. Under the open field system, a family did not have a single consolidated block of land. Instead, they farmed a number of individual strips scattered across 2 or 3 large communal fields. This meant you were always working alongside your neighbors. Your strips of land were adjacent to theirs, with only a narrow, unplowed balk of earth separating them. The chronicler known as Walter of Henley, who wrote a treatise on estate management in the 13th century, gave detailed instructions on how plowing and harvesting had to be coordinated among the tenants. If your neighbor was lazy and allowed weeds to grow on their strip, the seeds would blow onto yours. Your success was literally tied to their diligence. This extended to the commons. The common land, the pasture, the woods, the waste, was a shared resource essential for survival. This was where you grazed your livestock, gathered firewood, foraged for nuts and berries, and cut turf for fuel. But your right to use the commons was not unlimited. The manorial court would set rules or bylaws about how many animals each tenant could graze, a practice called stinting, or how much wood they could take. This required a constant negotiation and balancing of individual need against the long-term health of the collective resource. The concept of the tragedy of the commons, popularized by ecologist Garrett Hardin in 1968, describes how individuals acting in their own self-interest can deplete a shared resource. Medieval villages spent centuries developing complex social rules to avert this tragedy. Your very survival depended on understanding that you were not an island. You were a single thread in a larger social fabric. To act with pure self-interest was to damage the fabric and, ultimately, to endanger yourself. This collectivist mindset was not an ideology, it was a practical response to the harsh realities of a world with limited resources. We have enclosed our lands and our lives, we have our private yards, our private cars, our private ambitions. We have gained immense personal freedom, but we have lost the security and identity that comes from belonging to a collective. Is our modern epidemic of loneliness a direct result of our celebration of radical individualism? What would it feel like to have our personal success be so visibly and immediately dependent on the actions of our neighbors? Could our society relearn the art of managing a commons, or have we become too individualistic to cooperate for the collective good, especially in the face of global challenges like climate change? Number 13, could you refuse a request? In our society, no is an important word. We are encouraged to set boundaries, to protect our time, and to avoid being taken advantage of. The ability to refuse a request is seen as a sign of self-respect. We have a right to our privacy and our personal resources. In a medieval village, saying no was a much more complicated and dangerous act. The entire social and economic system was built on a web of reciprocal obligation. This wasn't a formal system of barter. It was a fluid, long-term economy of favors, what anthropologists call a gift economy. If your neighbor's ox died and he asked to borrow yours for a day to finish his plowing, you could not easily refuse. You might need his help next month when it was time to thatch your roof. If a neighbor asked for a cup of flour because theirs had run out, you gave it to them. You did this knowing that one day you would be the one with the empty flour sack. These were not seen as one-off transactions that needed to be immediately repaid. They were deposits into a communal bank of goodwill. The historian Christopher Dyer, in his extensive work on the medieval English economy, shows that these informal networks of lending and borrowing were rampant and essential. Court records are full of cases where these informal debts turned sour, but that only proves how common they were. For every dispute that ended up in court, countless others were handled smoothly through this system of mutual trust. To be the person who always said no, who never helped, who never lent a tool or a bit of food, was to cut yourself off from this life-sustaining network. It was to declare yourself outside the moral community. When your own time of need inevitably came, and it always did, you would find no one willing to help. A reputation for stinginess or unhelpfulness was a form of social suicide. This system was not about being nice. It was a highly practical form of risk management in a world without insurance companies, government safety nets, or savings accounts. Your neighbors were your only insurance policy. Your premium was your willingness to say "es" when they needed help. This created immense social pressure. It was probably difficult to get time to yourself. Your resources were never entirely your own. They were always subject to the potential needs of the community. But it also created a powerful sense of security. You knew that if disaster struck, you would not face it alone. We have replaced this dense web of personal obligation with impersonal systems, insurance, welfare, and banks. We value our ability to say no and protect our personal space. But have we paid a price for this? That is the freedom to refuse any requests from our neighbor. Also the freedom to be left completely alone when we are in crisis. What would happen if we saw every request for help not as an imposition, but as an opportunity to make a deposit in a shared bank of community resilience? Number 12. How did you celebrate? Modern celebrations are often private affairs. A birthday is celebrated with family and a few chosen friends. A major life event, like a promotion, might be marked with a small dinner party. Even our public holidays are often spent in the privacy of our own homes or backyards. Medieval celebrations were profoundly public and participatory. The key events of a person's life, birth, marriage, and death were not private family moments. They were community events. When a child was born, the baptism was a major village occasion. The choice of godparents was a critical social decision. Godparents, often neighbors, formed a spiritual bond, a quasi-kinship called gosebreed, with the child's parents. This created another layer of mutual support and obligation within the village. The celebration after the baptism, the christening feast, would involve many of the neighbors. A wedding was the most important public celebration. As described in historical sources and even in literature like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, a wedding was a multi-day affair involving the entire community. The procession to the church, the ceremony at the church door for all to witness, and the feast and dancing that followed were all public performances that solidified the new couple's place in the village. And neighbors would contribute food and drink to the wedding feast known as the bride ale. This was both a celebration and a form of community investment in the new household. Even death was a communal event. When someone died, neighbors would help lay out the body, keep vigil, and dig the grave. The funeral procession and the requiem mass were public rituals. After the funeral, a funeral feast would be held. This was not a somber affair. It was a way for the community to reaffirm its own continuity in the face of loss. The historian Claire Giddings has shown that these rituals were vital for processing grief and reinforcing social bonds. These shared rituals, repeated year after year, generation after generation, created a powerful sense of shared identity and belonging. They marked the passage of time and the rhythm of life for the entire community. To celebrate your joys alone or to mourn your sorrows in private would have been unthinkable. These most profound human experiences were things the community went through together. We have gained privacy and the freedom to celebrate however we choose. We are not obligated to invite the entire neighborhood to our wedding. But we have also lost the powerful social glue that these shared rituals provided. Is the modern wedding, with its immense financial pressure and focus on a perfect, Instagrammable day, a less meaningful ritual than a village bride ale, where the whole community contributes and celebrates? By privatizing our grief, do we make it harder to bear? What have we lost by turning the most important moments of our lives into private events rather than public affirmations of our place within a community? Number 11. Who built your house? If you need a house built or a major repair done today, you hire professionals. You find a contractor, an architect, a plumber, an electrician. The process is commercial based on contracts and payment. Your neighbors might offer their congratulations when it's done, but they're unlikely to show up with hammers to help you raise the walls. In the medieval world, and indeed in many pre-industrial societies, the construction of a house or barn was often a community effort. This is the origin of the barn raising or house raising tradition that survived in some rural communities well into the modern era. A family might prepare the materials cutting the timber, making the wattle and daub panels of Tate, but the actual erection of the heavy timber frame required many hands. On an agreed-upon day, the neighbors would gather to help. This was not a paid job. It was part of the economy of reciprocal aid. You helped your neighbor build his barn this year, and next year when you needed a new roof, he and others would come to help you. The event was often festive, with the host's family providing food and drink for all the workers. It was a combination of hard labor and a social gathering. This practice is documented in manorial accounts and artistic depictions of village life, such as the illustrations in the 14th century Luttrell Psalter. These images show peasants working together on various tasks, reflecting a culture of cooperative labor. While the lord of the manor could compel tenants to work on his projects, the boon work, this tradition of mutual assistance among the peasants themselves, was a separate, voluntary, but socially essential practice. This meant that your house was not just your private property, it was a symbol of your connection to the community. Its very structure was infused with the labor and goodwill of your neighbors. You were literally sheltered by your community. This also meant that the design and construction of houses was based on shared knowledge passed down through generations. There was a vernacular architectural style, a village look, because everyone used the same materials and the same techniques that they had learned from helping each other. Today, our houses are built by anonymous strangers. They are commodities we buy, not structures we create with our community. The process of their construction does nothing to strengthen our social bonds. What is the psychological difference between living in a house built by paid strangers and one built with the help of your friends and neighbors? Has the professionalization of all trades, including construction, eroded a fundamental form of community cooperation? If you had to ask your neighbors to help you with a major home repair project, would you feel empowered by their help or burdened by the obligation to repay the favor? Number 10, how far did your responsibility extend? Our sense of community is often fluid and self-defined. We might feel a sense of community with people who share our hobbies online, or with colleagues at work, or with fellow alumni from our university. Our communities are often chosen and geographically dispersed. For many of us, the physical boundary of our neighborhood is just an administrative line on a map. For the medieval villager, the most important boundary was that of the parish. The parish was the smallest administrative unit of the church, but it was much more than that. It was the fundamental unit of social and spiritual identity. Your parish was your world. Its boundaries, often marked by stones, trees, or streams, were known to everyone. One of the most important annual rituals was the beating of the bounds, or perambulation, which usually took place on Rogation Days, the 3 days before Ascension Thursday. The priest, accompanied by the villagers, would walk the entire boundary of the parish. At key landmarks, they would stop, say prayers for the protection of the crops, and the priest would bless the land. Young boys were often taken along and would have their heads bumped on the boundary stones or be whipped with willow branches. It sounds brutal, but it was a form of mnemonic device to ensure that the younger generation would never forget the exact location of the parish boundary. This ritual, described by historians like Ronald Hutton, served multiple purposes. It was a religious ceremony to ask for a good harvest. It was a legal act to reaffirm the parish's territory and resolve any disputes with neighboring parishes. Most importantly, it was a powerful social act. By walking the boundary together, the villagers physically defined their community. This is us. This is our land. Everyone inside this line is our responsibility. Everyone outside is not. Your responsibility as a neighbor extended to the edge of this boundary. You were expected to contribute to the upkeep of the parish church. You paid your tithes to support the priest and the church. You were responsible for helping your fellow parishioners. This created a very clear, if limited, sense of belonging and obligation. The world outside the parish was a foreign country. We no longer have such clear boundaries to our communities. We are global citizens, but are we citizens of our own street? Our responsibilities are often abstract to the nation, to humanity, but our concrete, physical responsibilities to the people who live within walking distance have all but disappeared. What if we reinstated a secular version of beating the bounds, a yearly walk around our neighborhood to meet people and discuss local issues? Has the loss of clear, physical boundaries for our communities made our sense of obligation weaker and more diffuse? In a world of global connection, is there still value in a fierce, localized identity tied to a specific piece of land and the people on it? Number 9, did you respect your elders? In our culture, youth is worshipped. We value innovation, disruption, and new ideas. The elderly are often seen as being out of touch, technologically inept, or a burden on society. We warehouse them in retirement homes, separated from the daily life of the community. The wisdom they have accumulated over a lifetime is often discounted. In a pre-literate medieval society, the elderly were the community's living library. They were the repositories of essential knowledge. There were no books on farming techniques, local history, or herbal remedies. This information was stored in the memories of the oldest members of the village. They knew which crops grew best in which part of the field. They remembered the patterns of the weather over decades. They knew the history of land tenure and could be called upon to testify in disputes about boundaries or inheritance, as their memory was considered a form of living record. They knew the traditional remedies for common illnesses. The historian Paul Friedman notes that the old wives of the village, often widows, were the primary healers and midwives, possessing a wealth of practical medical and botanical knowledge. This gave the elderly a defined and respected role. They might not be able to do the heavy physical labor of plowing or harvesting, but their contribution was no less vital. They were the village's memory, its consultants, its teachers. In the manorial court, the testimony of the oldest tenants often carried the most weight. Their age gave them authority, not irrelevance. Of course, it wasn't a perfect system. An elderly person without family to support them could fall into desperate poverty. But the ideal, and often the reality, was that they remained integrated into the household and the community, contributing their wisdom in exchange for care and support. The multi-generational household was the norm, not the exception. Children grew up with their grandparents, absorbing their stories and knowledge. We have replaced the wisdom of elders with Google. Any piece of information is just a search away. We have valued easily accessible data over lived, contextualized wisdom. In doing so, we have stripped the elderly of one of their most important social roles. What specific practical knowledge do we lose as a society when we isolate our elders and fail to listen to them? Could a mentorship program connecting young people with senior citizens in their neighborhood begin to rebuild this broken link? Is our obsession with newest and innovation causing us to forget timeless, hard-won lessons about farming, community, and human nature that our elders already know? Number 8, who owned the forest? We think of nature as something separate from our daily lives. We have our cities and suburbs, and then there is the wilderness, which we might visit for recreation. We have parks and national forests managed by the government. Access to nature is often a leisure activity. For a medieval peasant, the local woods, wasteland, and pasture, the commons were an essential part of the household economy. They were not for recreation, they were for survival. As mentioned before, the commons were a shared resource, but the relationship was deeper than just a place to graze animals. The woods provided the crucial wood pasture economy. Peasants had rights, often ancient and customary, to use the woods in specific ways. They could gather fallen branches for firewood as stover. They could let their pigs forage for acorns and beech nuts in the autumn pannage. They could gather wild nuts, berries, and herbs for food and medicine. They could cut turf from the heath for fuel and bracken for animal bedding. These rights were a critical supplement to what they could grow in their fields. In a bad harvest year, the resources of the commons could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Historians like Oliver Rackham, in his History of the Countryside, have shown how meticulously these woodlands were managed for centuries to provide a sustainable yield of resources. Practices like coppicing, cutting trees back to the stump to encourage new growth, and pollarding, cutting branches at a higher level to keep them away from grazing animals, were sophisticated forms of sustainable forestry. Being a good neighbor meant respecting the rules of the commons. You didn't take more than your fair share of wood. You didn't graze more animals than you were allowed. You didn't hunt the Lord's deer. Poaching was a serious crime. The manorial court spent a great deal of time regulating the use of these shared natural resources. It was a community-enforced environmentalism born not of abstract ideals, but of the need to keep the resource from collapsing. The gradual enclosure of these common lands from the late medieval period onwards, where landlords fenced them off for private use, often for more profitable sheep farming, was a social and economic catastrophe for the peasantry. It destroyed their safety net and forced many off the land and into wage labor. It was the privatization of a shared world. We have largely lost the concept of a productive, shared landscape that we are all responsible for. Our local parks are for recreation, not for foraging firewood or grazing livestock. What would our relationship to our local environment be like if our survival depended on sustainably harvesting resources from it alongside our neighbors? Could modern urban communities create and manage commons like community gardens, tool-sharing sheds, or even small-scale energy grids? Is the environmental crisis partly a crisis of ownership, a result of a world where everything is either privately owned or state-controlled, with no room for community-managed resources? Number 7, how did you help the sick? When we get seriously ill today, we enter a professionalized institutional world. We go to a hospital, we are treated by doctors and nurses we have never met before, and we are isolated from our community. Our neighbors might send a get well soon card, but they are not involved in our actual care. In the medieval world, sickness was a community affair. There were very few hospitals, and those that existed were mostly run by the church for the destitute or for pilgrims. For the average villager, all care happened at home, and home care involved the neighborhood. As we've touched on, when someone fell ill, their neighbors would step in. This was especially true for the women of the village. They would bring food, since the sick person's family might be too busy with caregiving to cook or work in the fields. They would help with physic, preparing herbal remedies based on traditional knowledge. They would sit with the sick, offering comfort. This is well documented in personal letters and saints' lives from the period, which often describe communities rallying around an afflicted member. This was not just about compassion, it was also about public health, in a rudimentary sense. A sick neighbor was a potential source of contagion. The community had an interest in seeing them recover, or, in the case of a dreaded disease like leprosy or plague, in isolating them. During the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which killed a third or more of Europe's population, communities faced the ultimate test. While some, as described by Boccaccio in the Decameron, disintegrated into a sauve qui peut, every man for himself mentality, others held together, with neighbors heroically caring for the sick and burying the dead, often at the cost of their own lives. The parish guild or confraternity was another important institution. These were voluntary associations of laypeople who would pay dues into a common fund. This fund was used to support members who fell on hard times due to sickness or old age. It was a form of mutual insurance. The guild would also pay for a proper funeral and prayers for the souls of deceased members. Being a member of a guild was another way of formalizing the bonds of neighborly support. We have created a medical system of incredible technical power, but it is also a system that is often cold, impersonal, and isolating. The experience of being sick has been removed from the community and hidden behind institutional walls. Have we gained longer lives at the cost of a more humane and communal experience of illness and dying? What simple, non-medical acts of care could we reintroduce into our neighborhoods, like organizing meal trains for sick neighbors or simply checking in on the elderly? In our fear of disease and our deference to medical professionals, have we forgotten that sometimes the most powerful medicine is the comforting presence of a neighbor? Number 6, what was more important than money? Our society runs on cash. Your ability to survive and thrive is largely determined by your income and your access to money. We use money as the universal medium of exchange. It's efficient, anonymous, and impersonal. While the medieval world certainly had money, and it became increasingly important over time, much of the village economy, especially in the earlier centuries, ran on other currencies: labor, goods, and obligation. The most important non-monetary currency was labor. A peasant's primary obligation to their lord was not rent in cash, but rent in labor. They had to work a certain number of days a week on the lord's demesne, his personal land, a system known as the corvée. They also had to perform boon work during peak times like the harvest. This system is laid out in excruciating detail in documents like the Domesday Book of 1086, which was essentially a massive audit of the economic resources of England. Among the peasants themselves, as we've seen, labor was constantly exchanged. You helped a neighbor thatch his roof, and he helped you shear your sheep. These exchanges were tracked in the collective social memory, not in a ledger book. Goods were another form of currency. A craftsman might be paid in grain or chickens. A debt might be repaid with a piglet. Rents and fines were often paid in kind. This meant the economy was deeply rooted in the tangible products of the land and of human effort. It was an economy you could see, touch, and eat. But perhaps the most powerful currency of all was reputation. A good name was worth more than a purse full of silver. As discussed earlier, a reputation for being honest, hardworking, and cooperative was essential for social and economic survival. It gave you access to the informal networks of credit and support. A bad reputation could leave you destitute and isolated. This is why public shaming was such a powerful punishment. The stocks, the pillory, the cuck and stool, for scolds, these punishments didn't cause physical harm, but they destroyed your reputation, your social currency. The increasing monetization of the economy, particularly after the Black Death when labor shortages forced lords to start paying wages, was one of the major forces that began to break down the old feudal system and the tight-knit village community. Cash is impersonal. It allows you to buy what you need from a stranger, freeing you from the web of mutual obligation to your neighbors. We have gained enormous economic freedom and efficiency through our cash-based society. But we have lost the social cohesion that comes from an economy based on mutual labor and obligation. What would our communities look like if we were encouraged to pay our local taxes, not in money, but in hours of community service? If we had to rely on our reputation to get a loan, would we behave more ethically in our daily lives? Has money, the great connector of global markets, become the great separator of next-door neighbors? Number 5, who was in your gang? The word gang has negative connotations for us, suggesting criminality and violence. But at its root, it simply means a group of people who go around together. In the medieval world, forming and belonging to small, tight-knit groups was a key survival strategy, particularly for young people. In the village, young, unmarried men and women formed natural peer groups. The youth abbeys or baccalaurearies that appeared in late medieval France and other parts of Europe are a fascinating example. These were formal associations of the young, unmarried men of a village or town. They had their own abbot or king and were a kind of village fraternity. As the historian Natalie Zeman Davis described in her work on early modern France, these groups played a dual role. And on the one hand, they were agents of social order. They policed the community's morals, especially sexual morals. They would perform haravaris, or round music noisy, humiliating nighttime parades outside the homes of people who had violated community norms. The victims might be a widower who married a much younger woman, a suspected adulterer, or a man who was beaten by his wife. The charivari was a form of public shaming, a way for the community's youth to enforce its unwritten rules. On the other hand, these youth groups were also a source of disorder. They were known for drinking, brawling with the youth of rival villages, and playing practical jokes. They were a way for young men to blow off steam and test boundaries before settling down into married life, and the full responsibilities of a tenant. For young people moving to a city to become an apprentice, the guild was their new gang. The guild was a professional association, but it was also a social and religious one. It regulated work, set wages, and cared for its members. But for an apprentice living in his master's house, the other apprentices were his new family and peer group. They worked together, ate together, and got into trouble together. These peer groups provided a crucial sense of belonging and identity in the difficult transition from childhood to adulthood. They were a bridge between the family and the wider community. They taught cooperation, enforced social norms, and provided an outlet for youthful energy. Our society has a more ambiguous relationship with peer groups. We worry about peer pressure and gangs. We try to channel youthful energy into structured adult supervised activities like sports teams or clubs. This is the idea of an autonomous government that polices the morals of the adult community seems shocking. Have we lost the social tools that help integrate young men into the community, leading to the alienation and anger that can fuel more destructive behaviors? Is there a way to harness the positive power of peer groups for community building rather than just seeing them as a potential threat? What did the Charivari, as a form of grassroots justice, accomplish that our modern formal legal system cannot? Number 4, did you need a key for your door? The modern home is a fortress. We have locks, deadbolts, security systems, and doorbell cameras. The door is a hard boundary between the private inner world and the public outer world. We value our privacy and our security above almost all else. The medieval peasant's home was a much more permeable space. For one thing, many peasant cottages or crook houses were simple, one-room structures. The whole family, and sometimes some of the livestock, lived in that single room. The concept of personal privacy as we know it simply did not exist. Doors were often simple wooden affairs with a latch, not a complex lock. In many cases, people didn't lock their doors, especially during the day. Neighbors would come and go. The hearth, the center of the home, was a social space. The idea of a stranger knocking on the door was less common because there were very few strangers in a village. Everyone knew who belonged there. This lack of privacy was a direct result of the communal way of life. Your house was not a sealed-off private kingdom. It was one node in a larger network of households. People were constantly borrowing things, sharing news, and helping each other. A closed and locked door would have been an antisocial statement. It would have been a sign that you were cutting yourself off from the community. Of course, this is not to say that there was no crime. People did steal, and court records are full of accusations of theft. The valuables, such as they were, might be kept in a locked wooden chest. But the primary defense against crime was not a physical lock, it was social surveillance. In a small village where everyone knew everyone else in their business, it was very difficult to get away with anything. Your neighbors were your security system. A strange face would be instantly noticed. A person suddenly possessing a new pot or a cloak would be questioned. The historian Georges Duby, in his History of Private Life, charts the long historical evolution of the concept of privacy. He shows how, over centuries, the home was gradually transformed from a semi-public space into the private sanctuary we know today. This was accompanied by changes in architecture, the development of corridors, private bedrooms, and of course better locks. We have gained the immense comfort and security of personal privacy. We can retreat from the world into our own locked space. But this has come at the cost of the casual, constant, and informal interaction that builds community. What is the social cost of a deadbolt? Does the very act of locking our doors send a constant, low-level signal of mistrust to our neighbors? If we felt safe enough to leave our doors unlocked, how would that change the way we interact with the people on our street? And number 3, could you survive a bad year? Our modern food system is a miracle of global logistics. We have supermarkets filled with food from around the world, available in every season. For most of us in the developed world, the fear of genuine starvation is remote. Our biggest agricultural problem is surplus, not scarcity. Our safety net is a vast, impersonal system of global supply chains and government aid programs. The medieval peasant lived on the knife edge of subsistence. Their world was defined by the hungry gap, the late spring and early summer when the food from the last harvest was running out and the new crops were not yet ready. A single bad harvest to too much rain, too little rain, a crop disease could mean widespread hunger and even starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, caused by several years of terrible weather, killed millions of people in Europe and was a terrifying reminder of how precarious life was. In this environment, being a good neighbor was the most important survival strategy. A single family might not be able to survive a bad harvest. Their grain stores might be empty. But the community as a whole might be able to weather it. This is where the moral economy that E.P. Thompson described became a matter of life and death. In times of scarcity, the community would enforce a set of unwritten rules. Hoarding was seen as a profound moral crime. A prosperous peasant who had a good harvest had a social obligation to lend or sell grain at a fair price to his less fortunate neighbors. A lord of the manor was often expected to open his own storehouses to prevent his tenants from starving. To do otherwise, to profit from the misery of your neighbors, was to risk a violent reaction, a bread riot. These riots were not just acts of desperation, they were a way of enforcing the community's sense of what was just and fair. Neighbors would also rely on each other to manage risk. For example, by farming scattered strips in different fields, a peasant was diversified. One field might flood, but another on higher ground might survive. This system, which seems inefficient to us, was a form of shared insurance. When the harvest did come in, it was a frantic all-hands-on-deck effort. All the community went to the harvest, reads one 13th century document. Everyone, men, women, and older children, worked together in the fields from dawn until dusk, because the grain had to be brought in quickly before it was ruined by rain. Your neighbor's harvest was your harvest because the survival of the village depended on everyone's crops being successfully gathered. We have replaced this community-based resilience with a dependence on a vast, fragile, and anonymous global system. We trust the supermarket, not our neighbor. If a major crisis disrupted our global food supply chains for a month, who would you turn to? How many of us even know which of our neighbors are gardeners, or have pantries stocked with food? Have we traded the resilient, if brutal, localism of the medieval village for a comfortable but dangerously fragile globalism? Number 2, what did you owe the dead? For us, death is a sanitized, professionalized event. When a person dies, the body is quickly removed by a funeral director. The grieving is done in private. We might attend a funeral or a memorial service, a discrete event that we fit into our schedule. Our obligation to the dead is largely symbolic and short-lived. In the medieval world, the dead were not gone. They were just in a different place, purgatory, and they still needed the help of the living. The community of the parish was understood to include the living, the saints in heaven, and the souls in purgatory. The living had a profound and ongoing obligation to the dead. This obligation took the form of prayer. It was believed that the prayers of the living could shorten a soul's time in the fiery torments of purgatory. This was not a casual or optional activity, it was one of the most important duties of a good Christian and a good neighbor. As the historian Eamon Duffy shows in The Stripping of the Altars, late medieval religion was intensely focused on this intercession for the dead. When a person died, their neighbors would gather to pray over the body. The funeral mass was a communal prayer for the soul of the deceased. But the obligation did not end there. People would leave money in their wills to pay for chantries, endowments, to pay a priest, to say mass for their soul for a set number of years, or even in perpetuity. Wealthier individuals could endow a whole chantry chapel, but ordinary people participated too. The parish guilds we mentioned earlier had as one of their central functions the remembrance of their dead members. The guild would pay for a funeral, ensure a good turnout, and arrange for anniversary masses to be said for the souls of all its departed brothers and sisters. On All Souls' Day, the entire community would pray for all the dead of the parish. This constant remembrance of the dead had a powerful social effect. It bound the generations together. It meant that your ancestors were not just names on a family tree, they were active members of the community who still needed your help. It reinforced the idea that the community was a permanent entity, stretching back in time and forward into the future. It gave every individual a sense of their place in a long, unbroken chain. To be a good neighbor was to remember and pray for your neighbor even after they were in the grave. The Protestant Reformation, with its rejection of the doctrine of purgatory, shattered this relationship between the living and the dead. The dead were now either in heaven or hell, beyond the help of the living. The prayers, the guilds, the chantries, they all disappeared. The death became a more final and perhaps a more terrifying separation. What have we lost by forgetting our dead? Does our lack of any formal, ongoing obligation to our ancestors contribute to our modern sense of rootlessness? If we believed that our deceased neighbors still needed our help, would that foster a deeper and more lasting sense of community? Number 1. Did you have a choice? This may be the most important and uncomfortable question of all. We live in a world that prizes choice above all else. We choose where to live, what job to do, who to marry, who our friends are. We choose our communities. If we don't like our neighbors, we can move. Our participation in our community is voluntary. The medieval peasant had almost no choice at all. If you were a villein or serf, you were legally tied to the land. You could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission. The people in your village were not your chosen friends. They were the people you were stuck with for life. Your neighbors were not an option. They were a fact, as permanent and unchangeable as the landscape itself. This lack of choice is horrifying to the modern mind. It seems like a prison. But it created a fundamentally different kind of community, because you could not leave. You had to make it work. You had to learn to get along with people you didn't like. You had to learn to resolve conflicts, to forgive, and to cooperate, because the alternative was a lifetime of misery and dysfunction. All of the ways we have discussed, sharing tools, participating in local justice, relying on mutual aid, enforcing norms through gossip, were not items on a how to be a good neighbor checklist. They were non-negotiable survival strategies forced upon people by their lack of mobility. The intensity of the medieval community was a direct result of its inescapable nature. The bonds were strong because they had to be. The historian Rodney Hilton argued that despite the exploitation of the feudal system, peasant communities developed a remarkable degree of solidarity and were capable of organized resistance to the Lord's demands. This solidarity was forged in the crucible of permanence. They were in it together for the long haul. We have gained the invaluable freedom of mobility. We can escape a bad neighborhood, a difficult family, a painful past. We can constantly reinvent ourselves. But this freedom has a hidden cost. Because we can always leave, we are less invested in making things work where we are. Our relationships with our neighbors are often shallow and transient because we know that we, or they, could be gone tomorrow. We have a community of choice, but it is often a weak and fragile community. The medieval peasant had a community of no choice, and it was brutally strong. This is the central paradox, the things we admire about the medieval community: its resilience, its cohesiveness, its powerful social bonds were built on a foundation of something we despise, a lack of freedom. Have we defined freedom so narrowly as the ability to leave that we've forgotten the freedom that comes from deep, permanent belonging? Is there a way to build strong, committed communities without giving up our modern freedom of choice? Or is the transient, shallow nature of modern neighborhood life the unavoidable price we must pay for personal liberty?